Let me just introduce ourselves. Thank you so much for having us. My name's Kate. I'm here with Jesse, Ling, and Kalila, and we'll just get right started. This is a presentation on a management measurement system for the Rail Commission for High-Speed Passenger Rail. And that our mission was to help the FRC create a support system for these decisions to evaluate program proposals. And that a couple of things that we kept in mind was that this system must be able to evaluate diverse applicants from state transportation departments to existing associations responsible for intercity rail, and anything in between. And that there was no existing decision model to work off of, so we really started at ground zero. With that, keeping in mind that the grant applicants must provide a large portion of the cost, so allowing for our decision system to evaluate matching funds, and also looking at the purpose of the grants, that building a new rail lines entirely devoted to high-speed passenger rail, as well as working within existing infrastructure. Our presentation today is going to start with some of the key assumptions that we looked at to lay it all out for you all, and as well as the stakeholders that we kept in mind while creating these criteria. We'll then move on to discuss the barriers and impacts that the applicants will face in pulling together the information that was needed for this judging system, and then going into this criteria themselves. The way we organized this was 4 top criteria with individual requirements for each of those criteria, and then concrete deliverables for those. Our assumptions began with this idea that the FRC's priority was to roll out high-speed passenger rail in manageable pilot programs, and that some parts of the country are more adaptable for high-speed rail, as well as more able to implement rail programs because of the geographic abilities of that area and the demographics demand. Also with that is that high-speed rail is beneficial in terms of decreasing gas consumption, pollution, traffic, travel time, and that is a cost-effective and viable answer to transportation needs and growth in our country, and that transportation needs will continue to increase. And finally, that people's perception of trains is positive, that we in America believe that our railroads are part of our personal identity. Our key stakeholders in this, we really focus on Congress at the top, in that they are the primary ownership of funding, and that they will be incredibly interested in the long-term development of this grant program, and in particular, the criteria for evaluating grants. We saw Congress as being able to speak for many of the various other stakeholders, but second to that would be the American people with this perceptions, and also focusing on the details that would matter to the American people and how it would affect those perceptions. With that, we also looked at the state and local governments primarily as applicants, but also as representatives of the American people. And then finally, with environmental groups and interest groups, we recognize that they have quite a sway on Congress, our funding in the future for the FRC, but also that they have to answer, not only does Congress have to answer to interest groups and various things like that, but that their buy-in is critical for the success of this project and the ability to really create strong applications on behalf of the applicants. With that is interest groups like labor unions, the rail companies themselves, landowners of the land that's needed, as well as the environmental groups' concerns. Now, Jesse is going to outline the barriers and impacts that our applicants will face for pulling together these applications.
Thank you, Kate. So we are going to outline the potential barriers that applicants will probably need to face and address in their proposals, and also the positive impacts that they can have with whatever project that they design. In 3 categories, and we're going to start talking about operationally speaking, what are these barriers and impacts. So operationally speaking, all of the applicants must address safety, and we also think that because that's going to be one of the barriers that they're going to face, and also the environmental concerns from environmental groups, and also making sure that their proposal is not creating any environmental havoc, and it's also addressing the quality of life issues of people in the area where they're proposing design, construction. We also think that the geographic feasibility is something that they're going to have to keep in mind, whether or not we're talking about flat land or we're talking about mountainous terrain. That's going to play into it. Also, the positive impacts that they could have operationally speaking, well, if they're successful, they can design a transportation structure that's efficient, and that is not just in terms of energy efficiency and sustainability, but also in terms of that it runs on time, that it's taking less time to travel than usual between two different cities. Also, financially speaking, we identified the following barriers and impacts. Financially, applicants are going to have to look at the cost budget constraints, and they're also going to have to provide matching grants that are not only upfront costs, but also sustainable in the future. We have to be able to see that they will have matching grants for the long term in terms of maintenance costs. Also, there are financial impacts, when we're talking about positive impacts, we see that they could really provide long-term savings in the long term, since one of our assumptions is that this is the most viable alternative in terms of travel for the long term, and also the most cost-effective alternative for the long term. We want to be able to see in their applications as well that they're going to have long-term savings. We also think that they're going to have to address attracting future investments in order to keep the project sustainable for the long term and cover those maintenance costs in the long term. In terms of political barriers, we saw that public perception is a potential political barrier. If the public sees a construction project coming underway and thinks that looks like a waste of money, government waste coming in and tearing things up again, we need to make sure that the applicants are addressing that potential negative public perception. We also think that they need to, like Kate had already alluded to, make sure that they are guaranteeing the buy-in of all the stakeholders. We also want to make sure that they're addressing that how approval processes can be really long for projects like this, and that it can take a really long time to pass through the whole legislative process, and how they propose to get around that, and that goes into the buy-in of congressional leaders as well, and local politicians. We also think that we need to be able to guarantee, they need to be able to guarantee partisan support on both sides of the fence. In terms of the positive impacts that they can have politically speaking, we see the real potential for guaranteeing positive public perception impacts, such as national pride, national unity, feelings of success amongst the public at large, if they're able to point to a railroad that was a successful project. We also think that it can really enhance quality of life in the public at large. Any city that's located on the transit route is going to have a shorter distance in its commute time than usual, and we think that that could really enhance the quality of life for a lot of people. So now we're going to go into the specific criteria that we have designed for the decision support system, and it starts with prioritizing safety, then cost effectiveness, then community impact, and feasibility. And Ling is going to start by talking about safety.
Thank you, GC. Since the safety and security issues lies on the top of our clients' concerns, we encourage all of our applicants to seriously consider the safety issues and also use the best knowledges from here and abroad to improve the overall safety conditions of the system. Okay, under the safety criteria, we have 3 requirements. The first thing we need to examine should be if the applicant has a commitment to the crash avoidance. Traditionally, in the United States, the FRS has focused on crash preparedness rather than avoiding the crash. I hate to say the word crash, but I have to mention it because it's so important. We don't want any accident that pushing our future riders away. And also, we need to evaluate if there is a solid emergency response plan, and we need to look into the written protocols or SOPs to see if it's draws on the existing best practice in the United States, in Asia, such as Japan, Chinese, and Europe, like Germany. And the third requirement we should look at is if the applicant has a commitment to the physical safety. It's daily based, every day. And we will look at if there's a plan to contracting engineers with experience designing HSPR trims. And also we need to see if the management, if the administration system is strong enough to support any emergency situations. After talking about the safety criteria, we will move on to the cost criteria. We want the whole system to be economic, sustainable, and to some degree it can support itself in the future with future revenues. Since the federal grants cannot cover all the expenses needed to build the system, we will first look at the matching funds. What are the sources of the matching funds? What are skills of the matching funds? And also, what is the time frame of the matching funds? Is this enough to support itself? And also, the second one, we will look at the cost analysis of the construction. We need a very detailed budgeting, construction budgeting that including the cost-benefit analysis, balance, and also, more specifically, we need to look at the fixed cost as the and the administration fees, personal cost, and also the variable cost, specifically the ridership. Do we have enough people who wants to take the train? And I think it's the applicant's responsibility to provide us some good numbers and reasonable projections for the ridership. The third requirement under the cost effectiveness criteria should be the maintenance cost forecast. We can learn from the history that usually the maintenance costs are underestimated. Sometimes it goes beyond 40% of the budget. Sometimes it goes beyond 20% of the budget. We don't want that to happen. So we want to see the forecast for long-term cost. And my colleague will introduce the other two criteria. Thank you.
So the third criteria we're looking at is community impact. The primary way that FRS impacts communities is by getting people moving and doing it in an efficient, environmentally sound way. As a result, applicants need to clearly show how they will improve public transportation needs of their community. So the first community impact requirement is to provide a report that describes future ridership projections, and this also ties into what Ling was talking about, and as well, how public transportation will shift from car and plane usage to train usage. The primary goal of the Recovery Act is to positively impact communities through economic growth. Large public infrastructure projects like high-speed rail can do this in two ways. The first is by providing thousands of new jobs just to build and maintain the line, and the second is by bringing areas closer together to facilitate economic exchange, thus improving the overall economic health of the community. So we're looking for an economic growth report that will need to project changes in both of these areas. Finally, we want to live up to Train's promise of sustainable public transportation through extensive environmental impact surveys. In particular, we want applicants to be able to assess the impact of high-speed lines on energy sources, pollution, and overall land degradation, since we are anticipating having to do lots of land purchases to expand the lines. And the fourth and final criteria is feasibility. And we feel assessing feasibility of this kind of project goes beyond a cost-benefit analysis to a full understanding of the human capital that will be required to build it. That's why this criteria focuses on the various kinds of civic buy-in that applicants will need to cultivate. The FRS Commissioner stressed to us the importance of demonstrating to the public that everyone will be able to take advantage of high-speed rail. That's why we have the pilot program. Applicants will need to be able to demonstrate numerous small successes that can be realized in a shorter time frame. For example, instead of building one long line from DC to Boston that takes years to complete, we want to see, for example, a series of shorter lines from DC to Philadelphia to New York and then to Boston, so that more of the region can take advantage of these trains sooner rather than later. It's also important that they demonstrate how they can achieve these successes on an electoral timeline so that politicians can share in their success. This will help with overall congressional buy-in. As a result, one of the main feasibility deliverables is just a timeline. Because public infrastructure projects of this magnitude require a great deal of logistical coordination, we are seeking proof that applicants have the backing they need to be successful. Letters of support from interest groups such as labor unions affirming past successes or planned partnerships is an important deliverable for this category. And finally, we don't just want to involve interest groups and politicians. We want to be able to involve average citizens so that anyone on the street can point to a high-speed rail and say they are proud of it being built. That's why we are requesting a strategic communications plan to keep the public aware of what high-speed rail can bring them. And now I'm going to turn back to Kate for a wrap-up of the proposal.
Thanks, Kalila. So the overarching criteria, as you just heard, to evaluate this program starts with safety, cost effectiveness, and then community impact and feasibility. While we did not rate these in any particular breakdown of percentages, we felt that that is something that Deloitte and the FRC can do together going forward with the FRC's buy-in, but we did feel that this order highlighted where we put priorities. And the big thing is that we felt these criteria primarily addressed three large concerns. Our first one is stakeholder concerns. We think that in order for a project to be viable, that it must have strong buy-in from the various stakeholders involved, and that there are demonstrated long-term support for the on behalf of the applicants, as well as future support. That's why we have the timeline requirements, with really focusing on everything from congressional support over a period of time, and as well as buy-in focus. The criteria focus on concerns that the various stakeholders would have to increase that buy-in. After that, we identify policy challenges and political constraints. We feel that the criteria addresses those too, in that the feasibility of the program, of the projects, really depend on successfully navigating existing parameters on behalf of the Federal Railroad Administration, as well as environmental concerns, environmental regulations, and also the we really do feel that timeline, again, will be a important measure of the feasibility of a project. And then the implementation risks. With this, we first start with safety. We think that and we believe that the FRC would agree with us, that safety is almost a requirement of an application rather than criteria, and that having a safe and successful high-speed rail project really will impact the ability of the project to expand and high-speed rail to continue in our country. With that also goes cost effectiveness, public perception, and the impact that each individual smaller pilot program type projects will have on the surrounding community. With that, we'd like to open you up to questions and any kind of thing we can flesh out for you.
Thank you guys for your presentation. One thing that I'm particularly interested in, one of our big charges with distributing these grant funds is to support job creation. And you mentioned job creation in your presentation, but what specific criteria and what specific information would you want from the grantees so that we can evaluate the level of job creation, both in number and types of jobs, with the grant proposals?
Well, I think the easiest thing to ask for initially would just be a projection of the new jobs that they would need just to create the train line, and that includes, laying track, various engineers. Our understanding is that thousands of jobs can be created just through making that basic budget for how to construct the train line. So that's number one. And then along with that, long-term projections on the kind of maintenance need to sustain the line, conductors, custodians, that kind of thing. And ultimately, we would also prefer to have a projected report that looks at how the economic environment of the community can change. What exactly will it be connected to in terms of, will it be connecting to a large metropolis that makes it easier for business travel to come through and create extended economic exchange? So we're looking at that in two areas. One, solid numbers on job creation, and two, just an overall forecast on what the economic changes could be if there's better transportation.
In addition to that, I think this is just the beginning of the high-speed railway construction. And in the future, we may have more and more projects going on across the whole country. So the existing engineers and administrative staff can conduct some training programs to the future employees. And I think there will be more and more people coming into this program to construct our country.
I had a question for Kate. From the very beginning, you mentioned something about trains being popular and trains being part of, I think you said something about identity, personal identity, something like that.
Right.
Could you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and we examined that when talking about the communication plan for our applicants, that we felt that there was an underlying belief in America as sort of a romanticized view of trains, that we have this history of, go west, my son, ideas of trains that could be brought up again and utilized to build buy-in from the stakeholders, particularly the American people, with this, we didn't want to tell the individual applicants what direction their communication plan should go, But we felt that looking at trains as something that could be part of the national identity, has been in the past and could become even more so again, would be both critical in the success of the program, but also an interesting way for the applicants to go in terms of creating identity, creating buy-in, and various things like that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Question. I think in your criteria you mentioned that you wanted the local governments or applicants to supply ridership estimates and cost estimates to you. Am I correct in that? All right. Well, the one thing I was thinking about is, kind of why you wanted them to give them to you instead of any of all other alternatives. So if you could just explain a little more on that decision and why you made it, that'd be helpful.
Right. And so one of the things we were looking at is trying to put a lot of expectations on the applicants. We tried to identify positive things it could provide rather than focusing on past failures or negatives that the FCR would have to go out and collect, in terms of timelines and the fact that the staff recently is now dealing with such a large increase in funds. And we felt that could be a time constraint, but that in hopes that the local governments would provide current ridership numbers on their current train lines, and also supplement that with current transportation numbers, relationships between suburban areas and urban areas, and projections in terms of what they think their demand is. Part of this pilot program was not just judging on what's the most feasible geographic area, but what would, in the beginning, what would really support and benefit from having a high-speed rail, i.e. large demand areas, and their history of rail as well as car and plane ridership would provide for that.
As a follow-up, how would you suggest we mitigate concerns that the applicants might be overinflating their numbers to try and receive grant money?
Right. No, that's, and if you want to answer we talked about this a little bit, that my gut answer is a little bit of, if they're all inflating, they're all competing here and there's only so much. But part of our requirements in the feasibility was hard numbers and backing it up with both, I think, the letters of support from the various stakeholders, including unions. I think you get a good idea of the ridership by the level of work and partnership with the unions that actively work on the current. And then in terms of projections, I think you're right there. I think a amendment could be to avoid external evaluation criteria for those numbers to make sure that they're not coming out of right field. But I think that we have faith in the applicants to provide correct numbers just because of the magnitude of this project.
And we are anticipating this to be a multi-tiered process. We're not going to take one application at face value. We expect there to be rigorous, assessment of those numbers that they're giving us. So there will be safety nets, as it were, to make sure that these are correct.
I just wanted to add that I think that one of the things that we're using in order to make sure that there's cohesiveness to the numbers is, like they've already mentioned, that all the stakeholders at large are all in favor, and also all support the numbers that are in the application as a solid unit. And then also, if they have stakeholders that are demanding the railroad, then you can also rely on their numbers about demand as well.
Any other questions?
Thank you so much. Appreciate you guys coming to present to us.